مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إنها الحرب غير المرئية، وربما تكون أخطر الحروب التي نخوضها وأكثرها فتكا. إنها حرب بلا قواعد حيث كل شيء مستهدف، وهذا لا يشمل فقط الطائرات والسفن والدبابات، وإنما يشمل أيضا المستشفيات والمياه والمدارس، وحتى إمداداتنا من المياه والكهرباء. إنها حرب المستقبل بالتأكيد، ويعتقد الكثيرون إنها حرب الحاضر. إنها حرب الإنترنت. لمناقشة التحديد الحقيقي لحرب الإنترنت اليوم، يسرني أن أرحب بالكاتب صاحب أفضل الكتب مبيعاً والمراسل المختص بشؤون الأمن القومي لدى صحيفة نيويورك تايمز، David Sanger. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Hiroshima changed the world, but there may be even more powerful, scarier weapons out there on the verge of being used today. These are weapons in the cyber world. And to discuss cyber conflict, what America has, what our adversaries have, and how we might avoid it, I'm delighted to welcome David Sanger to our show. David, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Rob.
David, what was the first time a cyber weapon was ever used? Who did it and why?
Well, there's a lot of debate about that. There's some discussion that an old Soviet pipeline that got blown up may have been blown up using computer manipulation. Certainly the Russians used cyber efforts in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the late 90s. But the sort of seminal event in the cyber world, the one where people really discovered that you could manipulate bits and bytes and make actual real-world stuff blow up in ways that previously would have required saboteurs or bombers, was something that the United States codenamed Operation Olympic Games, and which is known probably to many of your viewers as Stuxnet. And of course, that was the computer worm that was brought into the Iranian nuclear complex at Natanz and slowly infected the centrifuges that spin at supersonic speeds, blew them up, slowing down, not crippling, but slowing down the Iranian nuclear program.
So it's the United States that really took this to a new level.
The United States and Israel together worked on that program. The United States had a few goals. One was force the Iranians to come to the negotiating table for what ultimately resulted in the 2015 nuclear agreement, which I read has run into some trouble. The other effort, though, was to keep the Israelis from bombing Natanz, which had been threatened a number of times and which the United States feared might be imminent. And the idea was that if you kept Israel wrapped up in a cyber project, you might have a way of slowing this program without creating a military response from the Iranians. And that's what makes cyber so fascinating, because you can dial it up and dial it down, because it's hard to figure out where it comes from, because it's dirt cheap to do. Frequently, you can do a cyber attack and not get a military response.
All right, so let's back up for a minute. I think when most viewers hear the words cyber, they think of hacking and stealing information, stealing someone's credit card numbers, that sort of thing. But we're talking about something far broader than that.
We're so past.
Talk about.
We're so past stealing credit card numbers. Okay.
What are we really talking about when we talk about cyber in the national security sphere?
Sure. So there are sort of four levels you can think of cyber. So you mentioned the first one, surveillance. Okay, figuring out what's going on. That's no different than opening someone's mail in a previous era, tapping telephones in a more recent era, and then email and other computer traffic comes along, and the National Security Agency and every intelligence agency and the Russians and the Chinese figure out how to do surveillance. There's lots of that. not terribly interesting to me. Okay. Next level up, data manipulation. If I can get into Rob's bank account and move the numbers around, I could probably scare him. I might even be able to reassign some of those numbers to my bank account. Okay, that's another form of theft. It probably, I probably wouldn't. But it's done the North Koreans some good, as they have stolen money from the Bangladeshi bank, Latin American banks, and cryptocurrencies. Okay, so that's data manipulation. But you could imagine another national security use. Supposing you got into the database of the United States military or the military of any other country, and you just changed everybody's blood type. Imagine the danger you could do there. Supposing you changed the targeting data on nuclear weapons. So you can imagine the data manipulation. The third part is destruction of facilities. That's what Olympic Games was all about. We've now put so much of our infrastructure online, whether it is gas pipelines, water systems, nuclear centrifuges, the cell phone network, the 5G network that may get put together in, it's coming together in so many countries, that if you can get in at the control systems, you essentially can destroy the infrastructure without ever dropping a bomb, without ever entering the country. And that's why there's so much worry when you hear that the Russians are in the American electric grid, for example. And then the final level is the political manipulation that comes from information warfare. And that's what we all got concerned about after the revelations surrounding the 2016 election, that you get fake Facebook posts, that in the future you might get deep fakes in which, Rob's running for mayor and suddenly, you see a film of him saying things he never said.
And does this also include perhaps actually manipulating the ballot boxes?
It could be. Now, fortunately, in the United States, that's pretty difficult to do because our ballot system is offline and every one of the 50 states does it differently. So our backwardness, our disconnectedness is actually a protection. And if I was czar for a day, I would basically say, you can never have a voting system where there isn't a handwritten paper ballot that you can go back and recount, even if you then scan it and turn it into a computer system. So you've got an actual physical way of going. Some things, and democracies are one of them, are too important to leave just to digital means. But while people talk about that a lot, I'm less worried about it in the American context. Bigger risk in Europe and some places in the Middle East where in fact they've moved to all digital voting and it's all sitting in a way that you could manipulate it.
So how is the United States set up to address the cyber battlefield, both on offense and on defense?
Well, one of the oddities of cyber is that offense and defense are frequently merged with each other. Let me give you an example. You don't want to simply have a system that sees the attack happening when it's beginning to unfold in your computer systems. Because if that's what you're doing, you have about 1/10 of a second to make a significant decision, right? Not much time for meetings. So if you're going to have a good defensive system, you've got to have implants, basically malware, sitting in networks or elsewhere in the world so that you can see an attack gathering. Think of a radar system that you would put on an island far from your country so that you could see the planes coming long before they came to the United States. So you need the same thing in cyber. And in fact, the National Security Agency has put malware implants into systems around the world. And the Russians and the Chinese have put them into our systems around the world. Now you look at that malware, you can't figure out its intent. Maybe it's just sitting there to watch. But I can use the same implant to inject bad code into your system. Is that an offensive weapon or a defensive weapon? Depends entirely on how it's used. Now, in the US, we divide things up in a somewhat crazy way. The Department of Homeland Security is in charge of defending the United States generally, but most of the targets in the US are private companies, 85–90% of them. And they all are expected to have their own cybersecurity protocols. And the ones you want on the banks and the utility systems are a lot more intense than the ones you care about if somebody is manufacturing toothpicks, right? So not every target is of equal importance. The second problem we have is doing national defense. And there the question is, at what point would the Pentagon step in to act because somebody brought down the entire power grid or the entire communication system? And it's very vague in American strategy how you do that.
And so we have the National Security Agency, and then recently the government set up something called Cyber Command.
That's right.
What is that?
So the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command sit side by side. The NSA is an intelligence agency by and large. They decrypt data, they encrypt data, but they also can, when ordered by the president, go into foreign computer systems. And there's a big section of the NSA called the Tailored Access Operations Unit. They've recently changed the name, but that's what it was known for years, that goes in and basically is the special forces of cyber. Next to that is the Pentagon's U.S. Cyber Command. They're supposed to go protect the Pentagon's own networks, but also in wartime, do offensive cyber operations. And they have risen in import, so now they are of equal status with, say, Central Command, which operates across the Middle East.
All right, so when we come back from the break, I'm going to ask you about vulnerabilities that we have and how we should address them, and who our main adversaries are and what we're doing to stop them from doing bad things in just a moment. Our guest again today is David Sanger, national security correspondent for the New York Times. He's been on teams that have won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. David is the author most recently of this fantastic and admittedly scary new book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. All right, so David, vulnerabilities. When you look across America at some of our most significant assets, what is, I hate to give our adversaries some insight, but what is especially vulnerable in your view?
It would be easier to make a list of what's not vulnerable, because what's happened is we've taken old legacy systems, whether they are airplanes or power systems or phone systems, and we've, for reasons of convenience, computerized them, put them on the internet, and onto an internet that was never designed for security. So we're now trying to layer the security over a system that wasn't designed for it. The best way to think about this, Rob, is our initial roads were dirt roads, and then later on we thought, oh boy, these are a mess, and people are moving at high speed. So we began to build paved roads and then highways, and then we put breakdown lanes across them and slow, gradual exits. This is all an effort to try to build some safety into the system. That's what we're doing in the cyber world. The problem is that while we are getting better at cybersecurity, when you go into your bank account, they send you a 6-digit code back to your cell phone or something like that. We're coming up the scale, but our vulnerabilities are growing far faster than our ability to get better at cybersecurity. So the more things we connect to the internet, and there were 14 billion things at the end of last year that were connected to the Internet of Things devices. That is now going to be something like 20 billion at the end of 2020. They all have very differing cybersecurity characteristics. And so it's a big challenge, especially when you've got some very determined state adversaries.
So let's talk a bit about that. You mentioned earlier Soviet Union, Russia. Who are the other major adversaries, and why do they use this? I mean, the Soviet Union, Russia, rather, try affecting our elections. Are they all interested in the political aspect, or are there other things that they're targeting?
Many different things they're interested in. So, we know most of the hacking that goes on in the world is, either malicious or criminal. Somebody's trying to steal money, your data, your health care, your tax information, get your tax refund. For states, the 4 big players are that the United States worries about are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And what's interesting is their activity in the cyber world mirrors their activity in the real world. So Russia's out to be a disruptor, right? It's happy to go mess with your election systems and call democracy into question. China's interested in stealing technology, right? And getting military edge. So if they can figure out how to blind the United States by taking down our satellite data or interfering with GPS or something in a time of conflict, they would do it. But in a time of non-conflict, they're mostly interested in getting economic advantage. North Korea, stealing money because they need it in a country that's as sanctioned as heavily as North Korea is to fuel their nuclear program, but also just to have another way to get cash. But that's not all. They went after Sony because Sony was making a movie that was a parody about an effort to assassinate Kim Jong-un. That was a very political hack. And they brought down 70% of Sony's computing power. Iran, to try to show, you want to mess with our economy with sanctions? We can mess with yours. And so they've been into financial institutions. They made some efforts to get into a dam outside of New York. It's a dam I happened to play on as a kid. It's got no water behind it, but it was a nice try, you know. But they're getting increasingly good. And, you know, in part, that's a reaction to what the United States did to them in the attacks on the Natanz nuclear plant.
Now, others in the Middle East, Israelis, Emiratis, Saudis, everyone's getting in the game?
Everybody's in the game. The Israelis are extremely good, as we know, and obviously we're participants in the Iran operation. The Saudis, the Emiratis have all hired graduates of the NSA and others. They're frequently into cell phones and so forth. We think that in the Khashoggi murder, the Saudis were tracking Mr. Khashoggi's cell phone so that they would know exactly where he was and hear conversations that would figure out where he would be. So they were using it basically for targeting. We've seen evidence that the Emiratis have used a lot of this as well.
So if we take the analogy from previous episodes of big global weapons that scared people, there were then efforts to do arms control, to regulate, to control. Are there efforts to control or regulate this new world of weaponry?
There are discussions, but it's much harder than in the arms control area. And in the book, I discuss a lot of reasons why. But you know, in the Cold War, you could go into a big mountain in Colorado Springs and see where the missile was launched from. And thus, you were able to do deterrence because you knew exactly who you were shooting back at. That doesn't exist in the cyber world. You can hide where a cyber attack is coming from. Attacks on the New York Times have looked like they originated from universities in the southern United States, when in fact that was just the last bounce point from a Chinese attack, right? And many other companies can tell you the same thing. The other difficulty here is that treaties don't work because it's more than just states. It's terror groups, it's criminal groups, it's organized crime, it's teenagers. They don't tend to sign many treaties. So what you need to begin to move toward is what Brad Smith at Microsoft calls a digital Geneva Convention. Some sense of what's off limits. Power grids, hospitals, nursing homes, things that would affect the most vulnerable, which is what the real Geneva Conventions do.
So if you had, and we only have a few seconds left, if you had one recommendation beyond paper ballots
right.
For the American president to address this problem, what would it be?
It's that we need to think holistically about where our vulnerabilities are. You know, we locked down the Pentagon and the CIA, but nobody during the Obama administration was thinking that when you fill out a form to get a classification clearance, that goes into a boring bureaucracy called the Office of Personnel Management. The Chinese took 22 million security files, 5 million fingerprints before we even noticed that the stuff was flowing out of our system. So the first thing we need to do is understand the scope of the problem. And while the White House was off to a good start on this in their early days, they've since eliminated the White House cybersecurity coordinator, which was unfathomable to me, why you would go about taking apart the bureaucracy that was supposed to begin to coordinate all of this.
David Sanger, thank you for scaring the daylights out of our audience. Thank you for being with us on Down
Great to be with you.
There used to be significant cooperation between political parties. They're not doing that anymore. And it's just like, it seems like everybody is holding out for what they want, but the cooperation is not really there on the level that I think it once was, and I think it's supposed to be. And so when we watch what's going on, if your party is in power, then you're fine. If it isn't, you really can't do much about it. Right now, the Republicans are in power in the Senate, and they can vote everything in that they want or not in. That's good for me because I am a Republican. But when the shoe's on the other foot, it's going to be that way too.
In terms of love, hate, and other emotions, the writer of the biblical book Ecclesiastes was probably correct. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. But in terms of technology, he couldn't have been further from the truth. For centuries, people crossed oceans on ships, sent letters on paper, and made heat by burning wood, coal, or oil. In just the years since my father was born, all that changed, with airplanes, the telephone, and nuclear power transforming human existence. And then in my lifetime, we had a revolution that dwarfed even those changes, the cyber revolution. The creation of the internet may be the most hopeful, empowering, and democratizing development in human history, giving every person with access to the web the same ability to spread thoughts, ideas, and opinions as everyone else. It is breathtaking in its scope and truly revolutionary. But it is not without risk. The same power that can elevate ideas and transmit them with unprecedented speed to the four corners of the world is also capable of controlling information, distorting the news, and reaching deep into someone's personal secrets, their private files, their bank accounts, their sensitive photos and documents, for evil, malevolent purpose. The same wonderful technology that can print books on demand with the press of a button, that permits grandparents to see their children half a world away, that lets doctors treat patients anywhere, anytime, is also capable of stealing elections, stealing identities, and stealing billions of dollars with a few keystrokes on a computer. And as we just heard, a small team of technical experts in a basement armed with no more than some high-tech hardware can wage war with a ferocity and lethality that used to be reserved for the world's largest and most fearsome armies. The Chinese call this yin and yang, two opposite things that are two sides of the same coin, as it were. It's too late to put this genie back in the bottle. Our job is to figure out how to regulate it, how to maximize the good and minimize the evil. This is no easy task. But to quote a famous line from my religious tradition, it is not our responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but we are not free to desist from it either. We better get started. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول دور حرب الإنترنت في استراتيجية العسكرية للولايات المتحدة، أرجو أن تتواصلون معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.